Good morning. I have 9 o'clock and time to begin. Before we do, just a couple of quick announcements. Can anybody give me an update on some sick folks? I know Brother Terry's still in a little bit of pain. We need to keep him and Janice in our prayers. And Cassie, our daughter's mother-in-law, is still in Birmingham. They've got her in a rehab facility, but she's still, her mind is not exactly right yet. I guess that's the kindest way to put it. Still some, well, we'll just see how that works. Anybody else on the sick, injured, or wounded list we need to think about? No. Brother Tyler, would you lead us in a prayer then before we begin class?
Yes, sir. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you this day, and we thank you that you have given us the ability to gather around and study a portion of your word, and please allow that word to pierce our hearts, and so we can be the shine light for you through our everyday lives. Please let this time be a time of self-reflection on us, again, so we can put ourselves in their shoes and make sure we are living the right life, Lord. And dear Lord, please go with us through our everyday lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Most of you can't see it from where you're sitting, but I've got my Christmas tie on, because if you hear the words out on the radio and TV and every place else, people are saying it 'tis the season. Well, what season are they talking about? Christmas. It so happens that we are in an overview of Jesus in our classes, so this is a good time to sort of put some things into perspective. If you recall a sermon I did a month or so ago, maybe long, no, it's been a whole lot longer than that. I said we can use science, scientific fact, to prove, disprove, or help us understand the Bible. So, with the majority of the Christian world saying that December 25th is the day Christ was born, what scientific proof do we have that that is not correct? There is scientific evidence that December was not the birth month of Christ. The shepherds were in the field, so what? Wasn't cold. Okay. Montgomery, Alabama, if you know longitude, latitude, Montgomery, Alabama is about 32 point and some numbers north latitude, and that's north of the equator. Mobile is 30 point and some numbers north of the equator. Jerusalem is 31 point some numbers north of the equator. So the way the earth tilts and goes through its motions, Israel is seasons are about the same as Alabama's seasons. So if the shepherds were in the field with the sheep when they were told about it, that means, and it was normal that they brought the sheep in from the pastures and took care of them about mid-October, and that generally starts our colder weather until March area. So that means scientifically, Jerusalem, Israel is on about the same latitude we are, will have the same seasons. So if December is too cold for us to be out in the field with the sheep, it's too cold for them to be out with the sheep. Now, I said all that to say this. Nobody knows the day of the week, the month, or the year that Christ was born. We can get close, and we're going to do that in our overview. And what most people miss is that they will celebrate Christmas, which was originally Christ Mass as it was instituted, they will celebrate that one time a year and go all out, and they miss the important part of Scripture, which is what was the most important part of Christ's life? His death, that we are to celebrate weekly, remember weekly. Why do you think December the 25th was chosen as the date? Was to replace a pagan sun god? Okay. In that area, they worshiped Saturn, Jupiter, the sun. Also, they had a winter solstice. So it's actually a combination of those facts. And people try to use astrology and the stars and all to find out, go back and try to date the alignment. On the 21st of this month, 21st of December, there is going to be a major event that hasn't happened in over 800 years. Saturn and Jupiter are going to be within 0.1 degree of each other, which will make it look like a double star. And there's a lot of people in the scientific and the non-believing world that want to point out that that bright star was a natural phenomenon and try to date things that way. We're going to go in and date things by Scripture and come up with a little bit, at least into an approximate time. Brother Clarence did an excellent job in his class Wednesday night covering the genealogy through Matthew, and he also brought in some of Luke for some comparisons and all. But I'm going to start in the book of Luke. And before we get to the genealogies, there's several verses. And starting off with verse 1 of chapter 3, it says, "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar," and pause there. We can't find this out from the Bible, but through secular history, do we know what year the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar's reign was? You're sure we do? All right. Who did Tiberius Caesar replace? He replaced Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar was the one that was the Caesar when he was born. His reign, he died in 14 AD. Tiberius Caesar took his place. However, for 2 years, he co-reigned with Augustus. So the 15 years would actually start at 12 AD. So 15 years plus 12 gives you what? 27. So we're roughly, at this point, 27 AD. Is there more proof of that? Look at the next verse. Look at the rest. Pontius Pilate, being governor of Judea. All right. When was Pontius Pilate governor of Judea? Secular history says that it was 26 to 36 AD. Well, now that fits right in with what we just said about the dating of Tiberius. Why was there governors of Judea when Herod the Great died, and he was the one that was alive when Christ was born? We need to know when he died, and we'll get to that in a minute. But when he died, he split the kingdom up into 4 groups. And his son Archelaus was over Judea. So how all of a sudden is Pontius Pilate the governor when it should have been in the line of Herod? Well, Archelaus was not a very nice character. We'll just say it that way. He managed to rule as king of that area for about 9 years. Then Rome banished him to Vienna and then assumed that territory as a Roman province. And they started ruling that province by governors at that point. And then Pontius Pilate was the 5th governor of that region from 26 to 36. 26, 27 year falls right in line with that. Then it goes through and it lists the other territories, the tetrarchs, which means the 4th. So you've got the others that were divided out, Herod's sons, Philip, etc. Then in verse 2, it says, Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest. Annas was the first high priest. He was appointed by Rome, the Romans, to be the high priest. That happened in 6 AD. Again, we can go to some secular history, Jewish history to find this. But he was appointed in 6 AD and then ruled until, was high priest until about 15 AD. Caiaphas then, his son-in-law, is appointed, and now Caiaphas. So we know for an absolute fact it had to be after 15 AD if we're tying these two verses together. So why do they still call Annas high priest? Because it says Annas and Caiaphas, high priest. It sort of goes along the lines with if people know protocol, procedures, and everything, people's titles are from the highest office they ever held. If you have a governor that becomes president, what are they referred to as? President. So it's the highest office. So here he is still considered or called high priest. All of that falls right in line then with verse 23 of that chapter, which says, And Jesus himself, being about 30 years of age, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. All right, so Christ is about 30 years of age at this point, and we're talking about year 27. So if we back that up a few years, if we take 30 from 27 AD, what do we get to? About 3 BC. I'm not going to be dogmatic and say it was 3 BC because as long ago as the history is, covering 2,000 years, we've got to give a little bit of wiggle room one way or the other. So it was, let's just say between 5 and 2. That gives us a good range. Most people think it was 4 or 3 AD, somewhere in there. How do we verify that? I just said Herod the Great died. When did Herod the Great die? Because Herod the Great was the one that was president, was the Herod when Christ was born. Also, a year or two later, when the wise men came from the east, it was Herod the Great that sent them and decided how many, what age group kids should be killed. So if they're trying to figure out, if you're trying to tie those together, if he said 2 years and under, he was probably giving himself some wiggle room saying, well, it's probably this, but let's go this just to make sure we cover everybody. So he said 2 years and under. Most historians today, originally they thought that Herod the Great died in 4 BC, but most of your now historians agree that it was 1 BC. So if he died in 1 BC, and even at 2 BC, he had talked to the wise men about killing them a year, that would again put it prior to 1 BC, which would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 BC. Does all that make sense? Questions, comments? Seen any secular history of the what we read on that through history says that there's no evidence that that event ever took place. So if Herod said do it and then died before it was instituted, to me that sort of fills in a gap and backs it up a little bit. Others want to run with it and say, well, yeah, he said it, but it never took place. So that makes the Bible wrong. But to me, it just, again, validates the situation. Anything else? Okay. If we go then into the history or the genealogy, this genealogy differs from the one Brother Clunch covered Wednesday night in that one in Matthew starts at Abraham and works its way forward. The one in Luke starts with Christ and works its way back. I'm going to ask you to mentally flip those over so they're lined up here in just a minute. But why do you think that they are different? Why was there two? And we covered this a little bit Wednesday night. But why do you think there were two distinct genealogies between Matthew and Luke? Two different people. Really? Really? I'm going to put my devil's hat on right now. In Luke chapter 3, the one that you want to say was Mary starts out by suppose the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli, which was, and it goes down and lists Joseph's genealogy. Where does Mary come in? Heli was Mary's father. Now I'm confused more. How's Heli Joseph's father and also Mary's father? Go back to the, we need to, okay, what we need to do is go back into understanding some of the Old Testament, the way things work. Yes, ma'am. Okay. As I say, we have to understand a little bit about the Jewish family order back then. If a man had a daughter and did not have any sons, when she married, they would refer to that husband as the son of the father of the woman. Also, if they were married and he did have sons, and they married and lived in the same house, he would still be referred to as son. Also, if you notice, both genealogies only go through the line of the man, not the woman. So here, and it's very evident because if you go back to Matthew or the first part of Luke, who does it specifically say Christ's mother is? Mary. And who's Mary's husband? Joseph. Even before he was actually her husband, he was still considered her husband, because when they betrothed people, it was usually about a year's wait, generally, some less, some more. But during the period of betrothal, legally, it was as though they were married. And that is why when Joseph was going to privately put her away, if he was not considered her husband in fact, why would he have to put her away if they were not yet married? Because they were betrothed, which took on the same legal basis. So that's why it starts there. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out that could be confusing to some. If we look at verse 27 in Luke 3, it says, which was the son of Joanna, which was the son of Risa, which was the son of Zerubbabel, which was the son of Saltiel, which was the son of Neri. If you will keep your finger there and look at Matthew chapter 1, and go to verse, well, let me get to Matthew 1 first. If you will look at Matthew chapter 1 and go to verse 12, and after this were brought to Babylon, Jeconias begat Salatiah, and Salatiah begat Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel begat Abihud, and Abihud begat Eliakim. Isn't that the same genealogy as Luke, Zerubbabel, Saltiel? How does that work? Like I said, if you flip one of them and you're lined up, if we start today with our genealogy, when Terry and I come back to, or Aunt Dandra and I, since we're married, when we come back to the point where we have a common ancestor, then that common ancestor follows the path all the way back on the branch. So what we have here in these two verses is that you go back, you have a common source, and then it splits again and comes back to the common source when we get to David. How can that be? They share ancestors. How does that work? Legally. Okay, you're talking about intermarriage. Okay. Let's simplify that. How in the Old Testament, what were the rules in the Old Testament that would allow that or mandate that? Remember, if a man married a woman and he died and did not have children, what happened? The next brother married, and the first child from that marriage was not his, it was his brother's. So that's what you have. You have the line coming down, you have a situation like that, and then it splits out again. There's many, many people out there who try to confuse things and say the Bible's inaccurate because of all this jumble of stuff going on, which if you look at it by Jewish law, Jewish history, it all makes sense. Now, also, they say that, well, it says that Jeconias was the father. And over here in Luke, who does it say? Neri Saltel. Let's go back to 1 Chronicles 3 and verse 16, starting spot. 1 Chronicles 3. And keep your finger at Matthew on this. Keep your finger at Matthew chapter 1, verse 12. And then in 1 Chronicles, we're going to look at chapter 3, starting with verse 16 through 19. And the sons of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah his son, Zedekiah his son, and the sons of Jeconiah, Asher, Salatiel his son, Malchi, Ram also, and Pedaiah, and Shenazar, and Jechemiah, Hoshama, Nedabiah, and the sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei. So here it says that Pedaiah was the father of Zerubbabel. And Jeconiah was back in the line, and here it skips that. In the Matthew account, there are some that are left out. The genealogy is not complete. They go sometimes skip a father and go to a grandfather and back on up through there. But if you logically put these two together, understanding that there's going to be some gaps, but looking at the major points along the line, you will see that, as Brother Cox said, that in Luke, they go back through the line of Mary, and in Matthew, they go back through the line of Joseph. Again, why Matthew and why Luke account? Why are there two accounts, and why is it necessary to go back through two lines to get back to David? Because we know by prophecy that Christ was going to be of the house of David. So that's why we got to start with David. But why do we have two distinct lines, mother, father? Bloodline was through Mary. Legal line was through Joseph. Remember, the men were the ones in charge and not the women. But Joseph was not the biological father of Christ. So there had to be a bloodline. The bloodline went back through Mary. The kings were passed down to oldest son on down the line if they were alive and no issues. So the legal line then came through Joseph, and the bloodline came through Mary. Again, why do you think that the genealogies were listed the way they were? Mary's going all the way back to Adam. Matthew starting with Abraham. Let's start there first. Why do you think that the Matthew account picked up at Abraham? If you missed that, she's 100% correct. Matthew was written basically to the Jews, and where did Jewish genealogy and history start? All started with Abraham. If you look at all the passages that want to go back and list the father of, it always starts Abraham. The Luke account then was written to whom? Basically. To the Gentiles. Pardon? Everybody else, the Gentiles, not the Jews. Okay. So for the Gentiles, they weren't concerned that much with the Jewish part of history, starting with Abraham. So let's see where we get all of this from. So that line then takes it all the way back to Adam. Oh, well, which is the son, you are absolutely correct. Which goes all the way back to God. So that's the line, and that's where Christ came in. Questions, comments? Okay, we're finished. We can close class down now. Okay, Matthew was what profession? Sorry? He was a tax collector. And who was Luke? And we often accredit Luke as being a more accurate account because he was a physician going into more detail. So that could very well come into play. Personally, I think it just has to do with the audiences that were being addressed. But yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And as we go through, as Christ ministers and all during his life, as you go through it, what was the one big obstacle that they had to overcome? And it's just what you said. They had to narrow it down to one God instead of the many gods. Any other questions, comments? Brother Clint, you got anything to add or clear up the muddy water I stirred up? Or okay, so that basically takes care of the genealogy. And now if we'll look at Matthew chapter 2, we're going to fill in a little bit of a gap here because our next class we'll pick up when he's about age 12. So we don't want to get heavily into that, but it says, chapter 2 of Matthew and verse 1, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. Number one, it specifies Bethlehem of Judea. Why did it need to specify that? There was more than one Bethlehem. If we go back to Micah, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. I know Micah's in here. Who's got Micah 5:2 real quick? Please. Okay. Bethlehem Ephrathah is the Bethlehem in Judea, and it says little among the thousands of Judea. Bethlehem is just a short distance from Jerusalem, and numbers wise, there wasn't as many people in Bethlehem as there was in Jerusalem. So from the very beginning, the prophecy of Micah said it was going to be here, and now we're being told for a fact that he is born here. And then the wise men came from the east, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. And again, I had mentioned that your astronomers and all, they try to go back and look at the natural events and take things back to dating, and people are in awe of certain events. Like, I'm going to be standing, if it's not cloudy, I'm going to be standing outside on the 21st to see the Saturn and Jupiter line up. Hadn't happened in my lifetime and won't happen again in my lifetime. I want to see it. And according to the news reports on it, it's going to look like a double star because of distance and close proximity. It's going to be very bright and look like a double star. So it will be something to see. Verse 4 says, and verse 3 says, when Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Okay, we know that Herod has been ruling now for about 30 years. Why would he be troubled to hear that a baby was born? All right. Okay. Now, to me anyway, this points out one thing where the Jewish people that had it all wrong, because they thought that, or Herod thought that it was going to challenge his position. Why did it not challenge his position? Because Christ's kingdom was going to be what? Not of this earth. He was not going to take physical control over Herod's kingdom or Herod's son's kingdom after that. But he was troubled in verse 4. When he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, in Bethlehem, Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. That's what takes us back to Micah. And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, art not the least among the princes of Judea or Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Again, this is talking about the prophet that said that it was going to come from the least and he was going to rule over. And notice at this point, it's not just rule over Judea, it's rule over Israel, rule over the whole. And verse 7 says, then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired diligently of them what time the star appeared. This gets back to what we were talking about the astronomers and astrologers and all the other ologies that try to look down and make things a natural occurrence. Andrea read something to me the other day that she got a big chuckle out of, and she can make sure I get this just right. In general, the phrase was the miracle of evolution. And think about that a minute. The miracle of evolution. Do I need to say more? Was that pretty close to what it was, Andrea? And yeah. Yeah. Brother Jeremy, you getting a good chuckle out of that. Okay. Ask you not to give numbers or be too specific or anything like that, but over what period of time was the Bible written? We know that Moses wrote about the first 1,500 years historically of it, and then there was another few years, and just on the Old Testament side of it, we've got about 4,000 years of history, not to be dogmatic or get down to 4,001 or anything, roughly 4,000 years of history. And we know how many different writers there were of the Old Testament. Now, how many prophets, how many prophecies were there of the coming event of Christ over that period of time? More than a handful. More than a handful. Matter of fact, we probably get into numbers around 300 or 400 as prophecies of the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the New Testament. How is it possible, covering that period of time and this many different people, when we get to the historical event recorded in the New Testament in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are we 100% accurate? What are the odds that somebody 400 years ago could predict, and notice I use the word predict instead of prophecy, predict an event that would happen today and be 100% correct?
Accurate as a chicken and an elephant.
Okay, I'm going to leave that one alone. If you didn't hear it, he said about as likely as a chicken and an elephant being cousins. But it didn't just happen one time. It happened hundreds of times that the prophecies came out to be 100% correct. So that tells me anyway, or validates to me anyway, that the Bible had to be inspired by one person, if you want to call it that, to write down all of that to be 100% correct.
Some of these prophets did not live in conjunction with the other
Correct. They didn't live, some of them didn't live contemporarily the same times, some didn't live the same location, so correct. So then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. And when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. Now, I place a lot of value in that verse, because if you think it was a natural occurrence and you're following that star, if you're following, if on the 21st of December, you go out and you see that double star, the Jupiter and Saturn lined up, and you follow that, where are you going to wind up? Right back where you started from, because that star is not going to lead you to any particular place. Seamen always used the North Star to navigate by because it was stationary. They always knew where it was. They always knew where they were in relationship to it. But it's not leading them anywhere. And here it says the star led them and stood over that child. So when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding joy. And when they were coming to the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshiped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Back up to it, they came into the house. Where was Jesus born? In a stable, in a manger. Now they're at a house. did all of a sudden rooms open up? And how far did these shepherds come? Apparently they didn't travel, well, now we're at Wise Men. They came from a long distance because they followed an east star. But why are we in a house? I'm sorry? Well, it indicates that some time had passed. Correct. And that's where he's coming up with what age group he wants to do away with. So I can't believe I'm out of time. Brother Terry, you're going to have to pick up here and straighten up everything that I messed up today. Thank y'all so much for your attention.